Mr. Mattis.
Thank you very much to the Commission for inviting me here again. It's a pleasure to be back. I was asked a very, very long and broad set of questions that went well beyond Australia and New Zealand, so I'll try to touch a little bit on all of that and certainly move through it quickly so we can go through the questions. First point is that Australia and New Zealand both face substantial problems with interference by the Chinese Communist Party. In both cases, the CCP has gotten very close to or inside the political core, if you will, of both countries. The primary difference between the two has simply been their reaction. The problems that are there include the narrowing of Chinese voices, the CCP's essential monopolization of the media outlets, the takeover of community organizations, and in a sense denying the rights of Chinese Australians and Chinese New Zealanders to exercise their rights of freedom of association and freedom of speech in public forums. And this relates to the political systems of these countries, primarily because if CCP-backed people are the heads of these Chinese community organizations in those two countries, and politicians use them as their sort of advisors or their guide to what the Chinese community is thinking, it means that they really essentially have a CCP firewall, if you will, between the political class in both countries and the Chinese communities that live within them. There is the supporting of those voices that speak productively in Beijing's terms about China, and there is the issue of suppressing voices that don't, through denial of visas, through pressure placed on institutions, and in some cases sort of calls directly to those individuals. There's also the issue of what you might call kind of a three-way transaction where retired officials or politicians take on sort of consulting jobs, if you will, and when a company tries to open their business in China and open sort of different avenues where they need political support, the CCP side simply says, well, you need to pay so-and-so to open the doors for you and to arrange the meetings. And that way, there's never a direct CCP payoff to a Western consultant or person, but rather it's done through the companies themselves. So it's a bit of a proof to the pudding of Lenin's apocryphal comment that only a capitalist will pay for the rope that's used to hang him. With respect to the reaction, in New Zealand, both the last Prime Minister, Bill English, and Jacinda Ardern have denied that there is a problem at all. And although the current Prime Minister said that the attempts to intimidate and to steal materials from scholar Anne-Marie Brady will be investigated, that's a far cry from any sort of productive action when you have people who have lied on immigration forms that are now sitting as members of Parliament. And to quickly move to a recommendation, I think that at some level the Five Eyes, or the Four Eyes, need to have a discussion about whether or not New Zealand can remain given this problem with the political core. And it needs to be put in those terms so that New Zealand government understands that the consequences are substantial for not thinking through and addressing some of the problems that they face. On Australia, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has announced a very ambitious legislative agenda that's also a bit controversial. There's introduction of new counter-espionage legislation. There's the introduction of sunlight legislation, of kind of a Foreign Agent Registration Act in Australia, but where they've tried to plug some of the gaps that exist within our legislation. There's intelligence reform, and there's a new set of laws related to foreign campaign donations. There's been sustained journalistic inquiry into the issues. There is a growing body of researchers and scholars who are conversant and debating these issues both outside the Australian government and inside the Australian government. But I would say that we shouldn't be complacent that they have the answers or that they are necessarily further along. There's not, yes, they're taking these actions, but it's far from clear whether or not they're going to be complete and whether they're going to take an effective form in pushing back. How well do Australia and New Zealand understand the problem? The simple fact of the matter is that for the core set of journalists and scholars and researchers in those countries are basically the international core of the people that understand this issue. And nobody who can speak with any kind of authority on United Front work or China's efforts to influence or interfere covertly, frankly, can be credible if they haven't had contact and haven't had discussions with the Australians and New Zealanders who covered this issue. Australia probably has 6 to 10 journalists who are not Chinese speakers, who are conversant in the CCP language of United Front work and propaganda work. And that's not something that's even common among US scholars or people who are focused on China as a professional career. The last book on United Front work was published in 1967. And most of the time, people have dismissed the United Front Work Department or the CPPCC as sort of useless organs that don't really stand for much, despite the fact that the CPPCC has been headed by such lightweights in China's political system as Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, and Yu Zhengsheng. The United Front Work Department has also had a person on the Secretariat, which makes most of the routine day-to-day decisions. And there are very few departments within the Chinese system that can say that the head of their department regularly sits on that body. So it's obviously something that is important to them. In order to confront this problem, there's an issue of political will. And that means both in Australia and New Zealand, the United States can play a role by support and pushing these governments to take this issue seriously and to keep the discussion going. There's a second issue of understanding at the working level, the journalists, the researchers, the people in the security and intelligence services that need to know more about this issue and need to understand it. And there's a great deal of room for cooperation and expanding the cooperation that's already robust at that working level, but also keep being clear that there's value to having this discussion outside of government and keeping things outside of government channels so you don't deal with release issues or classification issues. And with respect to pushing back, it's important to think about how this issue is framed. I think you've noticed that a number of people have spoken very specifically about CCP or have caveated that when I slip up and say China, I'm really talking about the CCP. And it's important to keep the conversation going in that vein. We're talking about the party. We're not talking about China. We're not talking about the people. And that really is a critical point. The second is that if we're talking about pushing back on interference, we are in fact talking about protecting democratic values and enforcing our laws. It's as simple as that. It is about protecting the rights of our Chinese citizens and many others to exercise their free speech rights, their freedoms of association, and ensuring that they are able to act upon those. Additionally, there's no solution anywhere that does not involve the overseas Chinese communities. So when we screw up some of the espionage investigations and some of the tech transfer investigations, or we rush too quickly on some of them, and there are a number that you can identify, we poison the relationships that are critical to successfully pushing back, because the knowledge simply is not in a place like this room, but is elsewhere in communities with the people that have direct sort of day-to-day contact with the United Front system. So very quickly on recommendations, again, we have to keep a conversation going. If people are going to take United Front money or have these relationships, then they should be prepared to debate and discuss them in public. I think one of the reasons why University of Texas refused the money coming from Tung Chee Hua was they simply didn't want to have that conversation in public. There's no law against it. There was nothing legally at issue with them, but they didn't want to have to defend themselves publicly about taking that money. Second, transparency is not passive, it's active. And again, this relates to keeping the conversation going. You have to dig into organizations, you have to follow where they lead back to, and what you find is in fact quite disturbing. but it's not something that's just going to happen because we say, oh, a couple of journalists are going to write about this, or a couple of researchers are going to dig into it. It's a much, much, much bigger effort. Third point is the enforcement issue is one of the biggest ones, and it requires political will. It requires prosecutors and investigators to understand what they're looking at and why they're looking at it. And so in many respects, Australia is at the first stage of this issue of really debating, okay, what are we going to do? They pass the legislation, and that draws the lines in the sand about what is okay and what isn't. But if you're not prepared to enforce them, as the United States has not been prepared to enforce some of its laws, what does it matter? And you have to keep pushing this up to the top level so that it becomes a political issue that pushes it down. And I don't think that there's any sort of specific legislative action or specific actions of policy that are a substitute for creating the political will at the top and a sense of purpose and direction that leads to the investigative work at the working level and building a set of knowledge and tools to be able to push back. And only once those have happened are we in a place to really talk about something distinctive in the terms of legislation, or what tools does the FBI need? What tools does Department of Justice need to push back? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panelists. We'll start with Commissioner Tobin.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mattis, your recommendation in terms of raising costs for CCP interference, is that something that you can envision happening? And tell us more about your thinking on that.
I think this is what should be, if you will, a principle in the way that we're thinking about how to push back, that there's some issue of raising costs and ensuring that where there are problems that we can inject into their system, that we should do it. Because even calling some of this activity coercive is a euphemism for what is in fact a foreign government committing criminal acts against our people on our soil.
Yep.
And in these cases, if you're talking about issues of freedom of association and freedom of speech, we actually do have criminal statutes related to conspiracy against rights. And this is a civil rights issue, not necessarily a national security division issue for the DOJ. So there are, this is in fact a US law that is simply being, we're turning the other way.
Right.
And nothing about, to my knowledge, no one has really thought about this. And to the extent that we know that there have been issues with Chinese security officials on tourist visas or business visas, conducting United Front activities or intimidating or pushing back or conducting their officials' duties, we have not sort of pursued action against them while they're in the United States, despite the obvious visa fraud and felonies. Nothing about pushing back against Chinese interference is going to be cost-free on us. So the argument that what will China do in response, in some sense, is a question that I think is a second-order question when the issue is our laws are not being enforced.
And there are associations, the American Association of Higher Education and others, that this could be brought up at. But as you say, there is potential, there is going to be cost, but let's get the discussion going was your driving comment. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Senator Talent.
Mr. Mattis, two questions. Mr. Mattis, you said that, you noted that New Zealand's part of the Five Eyes arrangement, and I think you said in your old testimony that the United States should consider that on an ongoing basis. And I think the suggestion here is that there is some risk that they may have been compromised to the point that perhaps we shouldn't continue that arrangement. Am I reading you correctly that that's an option we ought to take into account, and how high would you assess the risk? And then I'll just ask them both at once. Mr. Shao, how strong is the sentiment in Taiwan's ruling circles that the activities you describe and that the danger of perhaps the PRC doing something opportunistically, really stepping up the coercion, do they sense it as an existential threat? I mean, is it something that that they're really making the highest priority of their policy? So those are my two questions. And the others, if you other witnesses want to chime in, that's fine also.
The answer is yes, that's precisely what I was implying, that it should be considered on an ongoing basis. And the way some of what was described to me is that, yes, some of these individuals don't have direct access to the product of NZSIS or the Ministry of Defense, but because they were close to the Prime Minister, in the case of Bill English, that anything on China that was briefed to Bill English was briefed to Mr. Yang Jian. And therefore, it may not be sort of official day-to-day access, but in terms of the conversations, the briefings, it was entirely present within the system. And I think because it has gotten very close to the political core, one of the major fundraisers for Jacinda Ardern's party has United Front links, that you have to say this is close enough to the central political core of the New Zealand system that we have to think about whether or not they take action, what kinds of action, what do they do to reduce the risk, because especially once it involves members of parliament, it requires the Prime Minister to make a decision themselves of whether or not there's an investigation of them. And if the Prime Minister is not willing to make that decision, then nothing can happen below that. And I'll let Russell answer the Taiwan question first.
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. Whether they see it as an existential threat, I don't get the sense that it's viewed as an existential threat. It is a challenge that they have been dealing with for a very long time, as I've mentioned, and that the cross-strait exchanges is good for minimizing misunderstanding, to help people to bridge the sort of political indoctrination that sort of separated the two sides for a very long time, but at the same time, we also include.
Thank you. Oh, unless somebody. Yes, certainly.
Can I just add something on the New Zealand point? Peter raises some really important concerns, and he's more knowledgeable about some of the specifics than I am, so I don't discount his concerns. But I would say that the Five Eyes relationship with New Zealand is extremely important to New Zealand, and it's one of the few pillars we have in our relationship. We don't have a free trade agreement with New Zealand. Obviously, we walked away from TPP. We haven't exempted them in the steel and aluminum tariffs. I heard an earful about this when I was just in New Zealand 2 weeks ago. I think there may be a disconnect between the political level and the bureaucratic level. I mean, the government, the bureaucratic level is really turning on China and sees its connection with the United States and Australia as really significant in that sharpening of their policies, their thinking about China. And we heard a lot of thinking that was encouraging. And so I would just say I would be very cautious about cutting off a Five Eyes relationship, because I think that really could have some tremendous negative blowback and push New Zealand in a direction that we would not be happy about.
2 other points. I didn't say cut it off. I said consider it, because and you just highlighted a number of carrots that are on the table. There are sticks and carrots that we have with New Zealand, and I think on this issue, we need to consider how to apply them and encourage New Zealand to find the political will, if they can find it, because it does, especially in their system, given what has to come from the Prime Minister's office, it is a question of politics, not a question of knowledge at the bureaucratic level.
Because, am I incorrect, that the Five Eyes, that's a very high-level intelligence, right? I mean, that's
right.
Yes.
And they were
very sensitive stuff, right?
They were granted formal access back to it in 2012.
I'm not sure of the date.
But
Okay.